With a single stroke of Hermes' sword, he severed her head. The myths are strangely quiet about whether she cried out, whether she stirred at the last moment, whether her serpents hissed in alarm. What they do tell us is that from her blood sprang Pegasus, the winged horse, and Chrysaor, a warrior born fully armed. These children, fathered by Poseidon, emerged at the moment of her death. A peculiar birth, grotesque yet strangely beautiful. To kill Medusa was not simply to end her life, it was to unleash new beings into the world. Perseus quickly tucked the head into the kibbasis, knowing that even in death, her gaze retained its petrifying power. This detail is worth dwelling upon. Most monsters, once slain, lose their potency. But Medusa's head was so powerful that it remained dangerous even after separation from her body. It was a grim testament to the magnitude of Athena's curse. At this point, Perseus had accomplished his task, but the story does not end so neatly. Heroes rarely complete their quests without complications. Medusa's immortal sisters, Stheno and Euryale, awoke and howled in grief. They pursued Perseus furiously, but with the helm of darkness, he vanished from their sight. One imagines their anguish echoing across the barren landscape, their cries both rage and mourning. For though they were monsters, they were also sisters, and the loss of Medusa struck them deeply. In their lament, we hear perhaps the only voices in myth that truly grieve for her. And so Perseus departed, carrying in his bag the head of a woman, once priestess, once victim, now reduced to a trophy. It is easy, from the modern perspective, to feel uneasy about this. Was Perseus a hero, or merely the instrument of further injustice? The ancients, of course, celebrated him as both cunning and brave. To slay a monster without even looking at her was no small feat. Yet if we pause and consider Medusa's story, hers was a life twisted by others, by Poseidon, by Athena, and now by Perseus. She was, in a sense, a pawn in the great game of gods and heroes. But the Greeks did not see her so simply. They saw in her death the release of Pegasus, a symbol of inspiration who would later serve heroes and even inspire poets. They saw in her head a weapon of divine justice, a tool Athena herself would adopt. To them, Medusa was not merely tragic, she was transformative. Her end gave rise to new beginnings. Her curse became a source of power for others. One might smile if grimly at the irony. Medusa, exiled and despised, was suddenly more useful in death than she had ever been in life. Athena, who once cursed her, would now proudly display her image. Heroes, kings, and emperors would wield her likeness for centuries. The woman punished for desecration became, in the end, a universal emblem of protection. It is, as ever, the cruel poetry of myth. And so, with her head in a bag and her body left behind, the chapter of Medusa's exile closes. But her influence was far from finished. For Perseus would return with his prize, and the world, gods and men alike, would learn just how potent the severed head of a Gorgon could be. Perseus did not simply take Medusa's head, present it to Polydectes, and call it a day. Oh no, that would have been far too simple, and the Greeks, as ever, preferred their heroes' journeys long and circuitous. The slaying of Medusa, dramatic though it was, marked only the midpoint of Perseus's adventures. With the head secured in the kibbasis, Perseus now carried a weapon both dreadful and marvellous, a gaze that could petrify even after death. One can imagine the mixed feelings he must have had. Pride, yes, but also a certain nervousness. Carrying a severed head in a bag is disquieting enough. Carrying one that might turn you and your friends into stone if you peek at the wrong moment, even more so. His flight from the lair of the Gorgons was aided, as we have said, by the Helm of Darkness. With it, Perseus vanished from sight, slipping past Stheno and Euryale as they raged. Their cries echoing across the barren landscape must have pursued him in his dreams long after. It is tempting to feel for them, immortals, condemned to watch their sister fall while unable to follow her into death. The Greeks loved a tragic symmetry, and the grief of Medusa's sisters was one such echo. From here, Perseus's journey became a catalogue of episodes, each showcasing the power of Medusa's head. One of the most famous occurred when he flew, over distant lands. Accounts differ whether he rode Pegasus, newly born from Medusa's blood, or whether Hermes' winged sandals bore him instead. Either way, the image of a young hero soaring across the world, carrying a deadly head in his satchel, is among the most enduring in mythology. The Greeks did enjoy their aerial heroes. It gave them a sense that their myths could quite literally rise above the ordinary. It was during this homeward journey that Perseus encountered Andromeda. Her story, like so many in Greek myth, begins with hubris. Her mother, Queen Cassiopeia, had boasted that her daughter's beauty surpassed even that of the Nereids, sea nymphs beloved of Poseidon. The god of the sea, never one to overlook a slight, sent a sea monster to ravage the coast. To appease him, Andromeda was chained to a rock as a sacrifice. Perseus, swooping in like a demigod from the heavens, found her there. It is difficult not to imagine the scene as painted later by Renaissance artists. The maiden bound, the waves crashing, the hero descending with sword and bag. Perseus slew the monster, some say with Medusa's head, others with his blade, and freed Andromeda, later taking her as his wife. A convenient romance, one might note, but then myths rarely concern themselves with courtship details. In this moment, though, Medusa's presence lingered. Her head, though silent, was the secret ally. Whether directly employed against the beast, or simply looming as a possibility, it gave Perseus a power no other man could wield. Medusa, even in death, continued to shape events. Her tragedy turned into a hero's triumph. After Andromeda's rescue, Perseus faced further trials. He attended a feast held by Andromeda's family, during which rivals contested his right to marry her. Outnumbered, Perseus resorted to his grisly weapon. Drawing forth the head, he turned his enemies into stone on the spot. One can picture the hall mid-revelry, cups lifted, arguments shouted, and then suddenly silence, every face frozen in horror, immortalized in marble-like stillness. It was the sort of efficient conflict resolution rarely recommended in polite society. In these stories, the head becomes less a trophy and more a tool, an all-purpose device for removing obstacles. Monster-threatening maiden, head. Overcrowded banquet with quarrelsome in-laws, head. Later, when Perseus finally returned to Seriphos, he confronted King Polydectes, the man who had tricked him into this deadly quest. Polydectes, unsurprisingly, was less than pleased to see the young hero back alive, let alone carrying the most dangerous object in the world. Perseus, wasting little time, revealed Medusa's face. The king and his courtiers stiffened into stone where they stood, leaving Dictys, the kindly fisherman, to assume the throne. It is hard not to admire the neatness of this resolution. One flash of horror, and a tyrant removed. In this way, Perseus used Medusa's head again and again, as if it were a sort of divine shortcut. And here we might pause to consider the symbolism. For the Greeks, monsters often embodied chaos, danger, the untamed forces of nature. Heroes who defeated them symbolized civilization's triumph, order imposed upon disorder. But Medusa was unique. She did not simply vanish with her slayer. Her power lived on, transferred to those who possessed her head. The chaos she represented could never be entirely eliminated. Instead, it was harnessed, domesticated, placed at the service of others. Athena herself would later adopt the Gorgonean as her emblem, sewing it into her aegis as a protective emblem. In this, Medusa became not only a monster slain, but a perpetual guardian. The ancients seemed oddly comfortable with this contradiction. To them, Medusa was both terrifying and protective. Her visage warded off evil, even as it embodied terror itself. In temples across Greece, her image stared down at visitors, tongue lolling, fangs bared, snakes writhing. Children must have peered up at those grimacing faces, half frightened, half reassured. That duality, fear as protection, remains one of the most fascinating elements of her story. Meanwhile, Perseus's life, bolstered by the possession of such a weapon, became a cascade of victories. He secured Andromeda, toppled Polydectes, restored honour to his mother, and eventually returned the divine gifts he had borrowed. The head, however, he presented to Athena. Here, the cycle closed in a bitter irony. The goddess who had cursed Medusa now claimed her head as a trophy. With it affixed to her aegis, Athena marched into battle, her enemies quailing at the sight. One might almost hear Medusa sigh, if heads could sigh, at the final indignity of serving forever as a symbol for the deity who had punished her so cruelly. And yet, there is another way to read it. Athena, in keeping the head, immortalized Medusa. Far from being forgotten, she became a permanent emblem of divine power. Her likeness spread across the Mediterranean, etched into coins, carved into stone, painted on pottery. The outcast priestess, condemned to solitude, became the most recognizable face of apotropaic magic. What greater irony could myth provide? One might chuckle, though softly, at the practicality of it all. The gods were not sentimental. They did not wring their hands over fairness or justice. Instead, they repurposed what was useful. Medusa had once been a problem, now she was an asset. Athena did not waste assets. She transformed her victim into her emblem, her disgrace into her shield. In a sense, Athena completed what she began. She turned Medusa into something untouchable, something that would forever guard, even if unwillingly. And thus Perseus, though remembered for his heroism, became little more than the courier of Medusa's power. His role was important, yes, but temporary. Medusa, for all her tragedy, endured in the cultural imagination far longer than her slayer. When we speak of Perseus, we recall his killing of Medusa. When we speak of Medusa, we do not primarily recall her death, but her power, her image, her gaze. Even in defeat, she eclipsed her conqueror. And so chapter 7 closes with this uneasy truth, that Medusa's story did not end with the swing of a sword. It continued in every shield, every temple, every coin that bore her face. Her head, severed though it was, lived on longer than any mortal life, and her story, tragic though it remained, became one of the most enduring in all of Greek mythology. The tale now drifts to one of the most famous and oft retold episodes in all of Greek mythology, the moment when Perseus confronted the dread Medusa. One must picture it not as a hurried, frantic duel, as later painters like to imagine, with dramatic brushstrokes and tumbling drapery, but as a careful, divinely orchestrated encounter, every step guided by the whims of the gods. Ancient storytelling rarely left such matters to chance. If a mortal was to face down a monster capable of turning him into an attractive garden ornament with a single glance, then divine equipment was really the least the gods could provide. Perseus, we recall, had already been plucked from obscurity by Zeus and Danae's unusual family situation, and had grown into a young man who seemed destined for something greater than a fisherman's life on Seriphos. Polydectes, the island's king with more ambition than common sense, challenged Perseus to fetch the head of Medusa. This was not so much a polite request as a death sentence dressed in mythic form. Yet, as in all Greek tales, the impossible errand was precisely the one that heroes were sent upon. Now, before Perseus could even think about approaching Medusa, he required tools, and here the gods demonstrated a certain generosity. Hermes, the fleet-footed messenger, lent him winged sandals, though one wonders whether they came with any sort of warranty. Athena, ever the strategist, provided him with a polished shield, not merely shiny but reflective to the point of acting as a divine mirror. Hades' helm of darkness, a kind of invisibility cap that would have made any modern spy envious, was also added to the ensemble. Finally, Perseus was given a keen, curved blade, sometimes said to be adamantine, harder than any earthly metal. The equipment list, one must admit, reads like the inventory of a particularly well-stocked video game character. Equipped thus, Perseus set out. But locating Medusa was no simple task, for she did not live conveniently near any well-marked road. No, her lair was said to be at the very edges of the known world, in a landscape of perpetual twilight. Some ancient geographers placed her home in Libya, others on the shores of the Great Ocean, while later Roman authors preferred more fanciful locations. The vagueness itself was rather useful, for monsters, as we have seen, are always tucked away where ordinary folk cannot stumble upon them while out gathering firewood. To find the Gorgons, Perseus first had to visit the Graeae, those strange sisters who shared one eye and one tooth among the three of them. One imagines family dinners being somewhat complicated affairs. With characteristic trickery, Perseus seized their eye and refused to return it until they revealed the way to Medusa's dwelling. It is perhaps one of the earliest recorded examples of effective hostage negotiation, albeit with ophthalmological overtones. Once he had the directions, he politely gave back the eye, which, one presumes, was not terribly hygienic after being passed around like a pebble. Thus guided, Perseus made his way to the lair where the Gorgons dwelt. Here it is worth pausing to consider what the Greeks thought about such monstrous abodes. They were not neat caverns or tidy grottos, but eerie landscapes where petrified men and beasts stood frozen, silent reminders of Medusa's gaze. To walk among them would have been like strolling through a macabre sculpture garden, every figure a warning. Later, poets emphasized this uncanny stillness, the hush of a place where life had literally been stopped mid-motion. At last, Perseus approached, but remember, to look directly upon Medusa was instant doom. This is where Athena's polished shield became the true hero of the tale. Perseus, keeping his eyes fixed on the reflection rather than the actual figure, crept forward. The strategy may seem obvious in hindsight, yet in the context of myth it carried deeper meaning. Wisdom and caution triumphing over rash bravery. One cannot help but think that many a young Greek listening to the tale was being taught, quite gently, that cunning and prudence were just as valuable as muscle. As Perseus drew near, Medusa herself was asleep. Here the myth becomes strangely tender. The monstrous figure, who had once been a beautiful maiden, lay in slumber. One wonders whether the storytellers inserted this detail to soften the horror, or to underline the tragic vulnerability of even the most feared creature. There is little evidence she had done anything recently to warrant execution. Her mere existence was enough to justify the heroic deed. Greek myths, it seems, were not always fair in their distribution of justice. With steady hand, guided by Athena herself, Perseus struck. His curved blade sliced cleanly, and in that instant, the legend tells us, Medusa's head was severed from her body. Yet her story didn't end there, for from the blood of her neck sprang two remarkable offspring, the winged horse Pegasus and the giant Chrysa, often depicted with a golden sword. This curious birth puzzled ancient commentators. How could such noble beings emerge from a monster's death? Some saw it as symbolic, a reminder that even from violence and tragedy, beauty and power might arise. Others simply accepted it as one of those mythic quirks. Greeks, after all, were accustomed to gods springing from the severed remains of other gods. The scene of Medusa's beheading became one of the most frequently illustrated episodes in Greek art. Vase painters delighted in showing Perseus with his shield angled, sword poised, while the Gorgon's serpentine locks writhed. Interestingly, early depictions of Medusa were grotesque, with tusks and bulging eyes, but by the classical period artists increasingly portrayed her with a sorrowful, almost beautiful face. Perhaps over time, sympathy for the cursed maiden crept into the collective imagination. Having secured the grisly trophy, Perseus wasted no time in making his escape, for Medusa's sisters, Stheno and Euryale, were very much awake and furious. Donning the cap of invisibility, Perseus vanished from their sight, while his winged sandals whisked him away. It is a neat conclusion, though one cannot help but feel for the immortal sisters doomed to grieve eternally, unable to avenge their siblings' death. The Greeks were often comfortable with leaving loose threads dangling in their myths, preferring poetic injustice to tidy resolution. Now, what of Medusa's head itself? Here the myth grows stranger still. Severed though it was, the head retained its petrifying power. Perseus carried it with him, using it as both shield and weapon. This, too, had symbolic depth. The very thing that had made Medusa feared became a tool of triumph once harnessed by a hero. In the ancient world, such logic resonated. Danger, when mastered, becomes strength. Let us not forget, however, that behind the heroic triumph lay a woman's tragedy. Modern interpreters, particularly in the last century, have re-examined Medusa's tale, reading in it themes of violation, victimhood, and the silencing of women's voices. To the ancients, she was a monster slain by a champion. To us, she may also be a symbol of injustice. The duality makes the myth all the more enduring, for it speaks differently to each generation. Even in antiquity, the tale of Perseus and Medusa held powerful resonance. Temples bore images of the Gorgoneon, the Gorgon's head, as a protective emblem warding off evil. Soldiers carried shields emblazoned with her face, not unlike how Perseus had borne the real thing. In this way, the monster slain at the edge of the world lived on, not as a forgotten corpse, but as an enduring presence across Greek society. One imagines the ancient listener, perhaps reclining on a couch at a symposium, hearing this tale with a mixture of awe and reassurance. Monsters might lurk in the shadows of the world, but with divine aid and a steady heart, they could be defeated. It was a comforting thought, especially in a culture where storms could sink ships, plagues could devastate cities, and war was never far away. The myth promised that even the most terrible adversary could be overcome. And so, the beheading of Medusa stands as a turning point. It is not merely the end of her life, but the beginning of her afterlife as a symbol, an artifact, and a source of power. Perseus would go on to many further adventures, but none would resonate so deeply as this moment of poised blade and mirrored shield. The monster's death was the hero's making, and yet the monster herself, paradoxically, would never die in memory. As we drift gently onward through the story, we can almost see the flicker of torchlight on the cavern walls, hear the faint hiss of serpents silenced, and feel the hush of that twilight land where statues stood unmoving. It is a quiet moment in myth, paradoxical in its violence, yet curiously still, like a breath held before the world exhaled again. And perhaps, just perhaps, in the long arc of history, Medusa's gaze still lingers, not to terrify, but to remind us of the uneasy boundary between beauty and terror, justice and cruelty, mortality and myth. The tale of Medusa might have ended with the swish of Perseus's blade and the sudden silence of her serpents, but myths, like rivers, seldom stop so abruptly. They twist and meander, finding new channels, and Medusa's story continues not in her life, but in the strange afterlife of her severed head. Few objects in the ancient imagination carried such paradoxical significance. Here was a trophy both terrifying and protective, a grotesque relic that offered salvation while radiating dread. Perseus may have escaped from the Gorgon's lair, but he did not leave the power of Medusa behind. He carried it with him, dangling, one imagines, in a sack that must have been rather awkward at social gatherings. The earliest use Perseus found for the head was not decorative, nor was it practical in the sense of hanging it over the fireplace. Instead, it became a weapon more potent than any sword. The very gaze that had brought terror to wandering adventurers was now under his control. There is a curious irony in this. Medusa had never asked to possess such power, and it had made her an exile. Yet once placed in the hands of a hero, it became celebrated. One might call this a double standard, though the ancient Greeks, in their wisdom or their blindness, seldom noticed. One of the first victims of this grisly weapon was none other than the Titan Atlas. As Perseus journeyed westward, he encountered the giant who held the heavens upon his shoulders, a tiring occupation by any measure. Atlas, however, was not in the mood for visitors. When Perseus asked for hospitality, Atlas refused, perhaps fearing some prophecy that a son of Zeus would bring about his downfall. Rather than arguing the matter, or writing a polite complaint to Mount Olympus, Perseus simply unveiled the Gorgon's head. Atlas was turned instantly into a mountain range, his massive frame frozen into stone. Ancient storytellers delighted in explaining geological features in this manner, and the Atlas Mountains of North Africa became a lasting reminder of the Titan's inhospitable manners. One suspects the local shepherds were not consulted about having a giant plonked onto their landscape. Next, the head found use in an altogether different setting, an encounter with a sea monster. On his travels, Perseus came upon the Princess Andromeda, chained to a rock as a sacrifice to a creature sent by Poseidon. The poor girl's plight was the result of her mother Cassiopeia's vanity, a reminder that in Greek myth, one's relatives could be as dangerous as any monster. Perseus, ever the gallant hero, intervened. Accounts differ. Some say he used the sword, others claim it was the Gorgon's head that did the trick. But in every version, the monster was slain, Andromeda was freed, and a marriage was conveniently arranged. One can only imagine how the in-laws must have reacted when Perseus introduced himself as the young man carrying around a petrifying head in a bag. But Perseus's travels were not over. With Medusa's head in tow, he eventually returned to Seriphos, where King Polydectes had been plotting all along. The king's unwelcome attentions towards Danae, Perseus's mother, had been the true reason for the perilous quest. When Perseus strode into the court and revealed his prize, Polydectes and his supporters were turned to stone on the spot. One can picture the awkward silence as courtiers froze mid-sentence, mid-toast, perhaps even mid-yawn. The threat to his family was ended, though the decor of the palace was now considerably heavier and less conversational. Having concluded these dramatic episodes, Perseus had little further need for the head, and here the myth brings us back to Athena. It was she, after all, who had guided Perseus and supplied the crucial mirrored shield. In gratitude, or perhaps simply to avoid further accidents at family gatherings, Perseus presented the head to the goddess. Athena, in her practical way, affixed it to her aegis. Whether a shield or a breastplate, sources vary. There it remained, a terrifying emblem, flashing forth in battle to scatter enemies. One must admire Athena's resourcefulness. Where others saw a dangerous relic, she saw a long-term military asset. The presence of the Gorgon's head on Athena's aegis had broader cultural significance. It was not merely a mythic detail, but a motif echoed across Greek art and architecture. The Gorgoneion, a stylized depiction of Medusa's face, began to appear on temple pediments, pottery, coins, and even doorways. To the Greeks, it served as an apotropaic symbol, a charm to ward off evil. The idea was straightforward. What could be more effective at scaring away harm than a face so dreadful it could turn men to stone? In this sense, Medusa's image, though born of tragedy, became one of protection. This transformation from horror to safeguard is one of the more curious aspects of Greek religion. The ancients were not squeamish about blending fear and reverence. A terrifying symbol could be comforting, so long as it pointed outwards, keeping evil at bay. The Gorgoneion was carved above city gates, hung upon shields, and painted on household objects. Even coins bore her likeness, meaning that everyday commerce carried a faint whiff of the monstrous. One wonders what a modern cashier might think if every banknote featured a grimacing, snake-haired visage. It is worth pausing to consider the artistry of these images. The earliest representations of Medusa were deliberately grotesque, with bulging eyes, tusks, and lolling tongue. She was the epitome of the monstrous feminine, designed to repel. Yet as centuries passed, depictions softened. By the classical period, she was often shown with a more human, almost mournful face, framed by serpentine locks. This evolution may reflect a changing cultural attitude, a growing sympathy for the cursed maiden beneath the monster. By the Roman era, Medusa was frequently portrayed as a tragic beauty, her terror and allure intertwined. The monster had become a muse. Meanwhile, in the mythic imagination, Perseus continued his career, but Medusa's head remained in Athena's possession. The goddess's association with the Gorgoneion was enduring. Statues of Athena Parthenos in the great temple of the Acropolis bore it proudly upon the aegis, a symbol of divine wisdom combined with unyielding power. When Athenians marched into battle, they did so under the protection of that petrifying stare. In this way, Medusa, unwilling participant though she was, became a guardian of the very city that had once cursed her. History, or myth at least, has a sense of irony. For the Greeks, Medusa's afterlife was not confined to Athena's shield. Her presence lingered in cult practice and in the imaginative geography of the world. Writers described springs that gushed from the earth where her blood had fallen. One such spring, Hippocrene, was said to have been created when Pegasus struck the ground with his hoof. Poets drank from its waters, gaining inspiration. Thus, from Medusa's death arose not only monsters and weapons, but also fountains of creativity. Even the Muses, those gentle inspirers of song and story, owed a debt to the severed head. It is almost as though the Greeks were saying, from horror comes art, from silence comes poetry. Medusa's story also seeped into funerary contexts. Her face appeared on sarcophagi, perhaps to guard the dead from evil on their journey to the underworld. The idea that she might protect rather than merely petrify was deeply ingrained. Indeed, one could argue that the Gorgon became less a figure of mythic terror and more a household deity of sorts, woven into the fabric of daily life. And yet, beneath all these uses and reinterpretations, the tragedy of Medusa lingered. Ancient authors did not dwell upon her sorrow, but later generations did. The Romans, particularly Ovid in his Metamorphoses, gave her a voice of sorts, telling how she had once been a beautiful maiden wronged by Poseidon and punished by Athena. This version emphasized her victimhood, her transformation not as a crime, but as a cruel fate. From then on, the sympathetic Medusa began to haunt literature and art, offering not just fear but pity. Thus, Chapter 9, in the long tale of Medusa, reveals a paradox. In death, she was more influential than she had ever been in life. Her head toppled kings, tamed monsters, adorned gods, protected cities, inspired poets, and guarded the dead. She became at once a weapon, a charm, a muse, and a symbol. For a figure once cursed into isolation, it was an astonishing afterlife. And it speaks to the peculiar genius of Greek mythology that even in the cruelest stories, transformation is never final. Death itself becomes a doorway to new meanings. As the ancient listener dozed by the fire, lulled by these tales, they might have felt a curious comfort. If even a monster like Medusa could be turned into a source of protection and art, then perhaps the terrors of the world, storms, wars, plagues, might also yield something of value. Myth was not merely entertainment, it was philosophy in disguise. And in that philosophy, Medusa endured, her stony gaze softening across the centuries. Her serpents hissing not in anger, but in eternal vigilance, watching over those who dared to remember her. The story of Medusa does not end with Perseus, nor even with Athena, nor with the countless statues and shields that bore her likeness. In truth, the story of Medusa never really ends at all. Like the serpents that writhed in her hair, her tail coils and uncoils across the centuries, twisting itself into new shapes for each generation that gazes upon it. What began as a grim, cautionary myth in the oral traditions of the Greeks became over time an enduring symbol, sometimes of terror, sometimes of beauty, and sometimes, curiously enough, of protection and even empowerment. When we look to the Romans, we find Medusa already transformed from a monster lurking in some obscure cavern to an established motif of imperial power. Roman villas, with their mosaics of heroic deeds and sea nymphs, often included a stern-faced Medusa, glaring from a central panel. One can only imagine the effect on a dinner guest when they glanced down at the tiled floor and found themselves gazing into her petrifying eyes whilst balancing a plate of olives. Coins of emperors like Caligula and Claudius bore her image as well, proof that the Gorgonion had crossed from a potropaic charm into official state iconography. If a monster once punished by the gods could end up decorating the pocket change of Rome, then one sees just how flexible myths could be. The Romans, of course, had a talent for adopting Greek myths wholesale, seasoning them lightly with their own sensibilities. For them, Medusa was not only a story of heroism and horror, but also a handy visual shorthand for warding off the evil eye, that ancient Mediterranean fear of destructive envy. Amulets with her face were worn, placed in tombs, or built into household shrines. Thus, long after her death at Perseus's hands, Medusa continued to haunt daily life, not as a source of dread, but as a kind of celestial security guard. A monster turned mascot. Yet, myths are rarely static.